Hey guys, Shane here with etrailer.com. Today I have a 2020 Grand Design Momentum fifth wheel. I want to walk through how to install the Hydrastar Hydraulic Brake Kit. When you have a trailer this size, you can see it's a triple axle. We want and we need maximum braking power. What normally comes on these trailers is drum brakes. Adding a hydraulic kit to it is going to give you better braking power so that you're able to stop this size of a trailer. This kit's going to be designed for triple axle trailers with 7,000 pound axles. The nice thing about it when you compare it to some of the other types out there is this is a complete kit, so it's going to come with everything you need to get it installed. Where some of the other ones, they come pieced, so it's going to take you a little bit of time to go out and try to figure out what parts you need. You're going to be 13-inch rotors, and they're going to be 8 on 6.5. They're also coming with the calipers and the pads pre-installed. Now when we compare our new disc brakes to our old drum brakes, these are typically what are going to come on trailers. You notice all the components that are in here. That's a lot more stuff we have to worry about. With disc brakes, if we have to get in here and do any work, change the pads or anything like that, it's very easy. You remove 2 screws, pop this off, replace the pads, and then put it back in place. With this, you almost have to take the whole wheel assembly off, including the bearings, to get to this. Just to change the pads, it's a much bigger process. You have a bunch of springs in here, just becomes a big pain. Also, the wheel seal mounts right inside of here. So if that leaks, it's potentially leaking on all the pads that are inside here, causing damage to them, could cause an issue later on. We don't want that. We want to make our job easy. We want to make sure that our trailer is going to stop. That's why I'm going to suggest going with the Hydrastar Hydraulic Brake Kit. Kit's going to come with all the hard lines to run from the actuator back to each wheel, the fitting to tie into them, and a rubber line that goes down to each caliper. Our actuator is going to have an electrically controlled proportioning valve. And what that does is it makes sure that each one of your wheels has the same amount of braking pressure. It's going to give us 1600 psi max output. When we compare that to electric brakes or drum brakes, they require significantly less output, but you're also getting significantly less braking power than you will with this setup. As far as the installation process, it's pretty straightforward. Not really difficult. It is time consuming, but again, not difficult. And in my professional opinion, a trailer this size, I would definitely go with a hydraulic setup like this over a drum brake setup. All that being said, let's go ahead and walk through how to get it installed. To start our installation, you need to get your wheel off the ground. A couple ways you can do it. We actually have stands, but what you can do is you can use a jack up the side of the axle of the wheel you're going to be working on. Make sure you put a jack stand on it so it's secured. And then you want to take your wheel off. Once you get your wheel off, we need to take this cap off. What we don't want to do, because we're going to reuse these, is we're not just going to grab it with pliers because it kind of squeezes them together. So we're going to take a flathead screwdriver, we're going to get right in this edge, and once we get it pried out, we can just pry the whole thing off. I'll set this aside. We're going to wipe that grease off, and make sure you have a bunch of paper towels with you. We're going to pop this clip off, and you want to hold on to that because we're going to be reinstalling it. We're going to take this nut off, and it shouldn't be on there tight. You should be able to just spin it off. Now what I like to do is when I take these off, even though this is a new trailer and it's got new grease in it, is clean these off because we're going to be putting new grease in. Another thing to keep in mind is make sure you try to match your grease. Some greases will not work together. So if you have a certain kind of grease in there, you want to make sure you're using the same stuff. Next thing you want to do is grab your drum, just kind of pull it out. What that's going to do is going to pull that bearing and this washer off. We will be putting new bearings in, but this washer we need to hold on to because we're going to be putting it back on. We're going to pull this off. We'll set it aside. Wipe all this grease off. We're going to take a 9/16. We're going to remove the 5 bolts holding this up. And we're going to be reusing this hardware. We're going to take this, and you don't just want to pull it off because it's going to have some wires running to it. Pull it off a little bit, kind of spin it. On the back side, we're going to have some wires. There's 2 wires that are coming out of it. There are 2 black wires. We need to cut those off the lines coming from the trailer. Once you get those off, you can remove this and set it aside. What I like to do is take a little bit of anti-seize by Loctite. If you don't have any, you can find it here. We're going to put it on each one of our studs. You're going to have a bracket that looks like this. This side is going to go towards the inside. We're going to slide it on. I'm going to make sure that this is facing back. Once you get that on, reinstall the nuts that you had pulled off. Once you have the nuts back in place, go ahead and tighten them in place. You just want to make sure you don't over tighten these where the star washer starts to break apart. Next, you want to take your rotor. What I like to do is take the box that the rotor comes in and cut a piece of it off and set your rotor upside down on it. I just don't like setting them on the ground. It's completely up to you. This kind of keeps any potential contaminants from getting on the inside down there or damaging the end of it. You're going to need your bigger bearing, your inner bearing, your smaller outer bearing, and your seal. What we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of grease, even though this is greasable, which is why we're using the old caps. I'm going to go ahead and put some grease on here and just kind of grease up this end here, and then we'll grease up our bearings. This way, when we put our rotor on with our new bearings in it, it's not dry here. And what I like to do is the way my dad showed me when I was younger. And we're going to pre-pack these bearings. Even though we're going to shoot grease in here and it's going to pack them, I like to pre-pack them. So what I like to do is take some grease, put it in your hand, in the open edge here on the front and the back. What we're going to do is we're going to take it like this, and we're going to push that grease in there. And what it's doing is it's pushing grease in between these bearings up inside here. I'm going to take it, you can see how it's angled. We're going to put the skinny side facing in. Grab it right in like that. It's a good idea. If you have a seal driver, it's going to look like this. To use it, what I like to do before I use that, to make sure that this goes down in there evenly, we'll take a block of wood, same, a little bit bigger than the seal itself, and we're just going to tap it. I'm going to take this guy and just start going around. We want it flush with the outside. I'll take this, I'm going to slide it on. Make sure you push it all the way back. And then we're going to pre-pack our front bearing. Once we get that one pre-packed, again, skinny side facing in. We're going to slide it in just like that. We're going to put on the washer. You'll notice there's a flat side. If you look on this stud, there's a flat side. Just match that up. That's going to go against the bearing. We're going to take the nut, screw it into place, and we're not going to over tighten this. We're just going to hand tighten it. We just want to make sure that we can grab our rotor and there's no play in it. Then we're going to take the clip. There's a little tab on it that's going to go to the flat side of the stud or the axle. And we're going to push it over the nut. And we're going to take our grease gun and we're going to pump grease in there until it starts coming out here. Then we can reinstall our cap. Make sure there's no gaps all the way around it. Once there's no gaps, it is on there as far as it needs to go. You're going to have a couple of studs on your caliper with a sleeve. You're going to make sure you push those out like that. If anything, make sure you leave the top one in place. This is going to be the back or the inside. This is going to be facing out towards the tire. We're going to slide it right over our rotor in between the top and bottom part of that bracket. If you find that with the brake pads on, it's not sliding over the top of your rotor, what you can do is take your pads off. You can take a small solid surface and this ring right here, that boot expands once it's got pressure. What you can do is we're going to take that wood, because we want to make sure when we compress it in, it's going in even. We're going to take a clamp, we're going to go around the outside, and we're going to compress that in. And put your pads back in place. Make sure your sleeves are out of the way. And we can slide this in place. Once you get it lined up, the studs with the sleeves, go ahead and tighten those into place. We're going to hand tighten them right now to make sure that they are going in straight. Then we'll take a 1/2 inch wrench and we'll tighten them into place. Again, we don't want to over tighten these. You just want to make sure they're fairly snug. Once you're done with one, you're going to repeat that same process for the remaining wheels. Once you get all your brake components installed on the axles, next thing we're going to do is we need to mount our actuator. Typically we like to mount them up on top of this box because they're up and out of the way and they're easily accessible, and most people use this area for storage. This box is a little thin, so what I like to do is I've got a piece of wood up here and I put a couple of self-tappers through the wood, through this panel, and now you can see I went along this edge and along that back edge, and that's to keep it stable. And this is actually going to, we'll use a couple of longer self-tappers and run them through here, through the wood, and then through this panel. So that'll hold that in place. Now, keep in mind, if you don't do it like this, anywhere you mount it, you have to make sure your line coming out of it, because it's going to be a hard line, is not doing a real sharp bend, because we don't want it kinked. That affects the flow of the fluid going through. So what we're going to do is we're going to come out, kind of go down to the floor here, straight across, and then I'm going to put a hole back in this corner, run my line out, and then all the paneling underneath the trailer, there's self-tappers that hold it in place. Pull that down, you can take that line, that brake line, and run it right underneath that paneling, and then put your self-tappers back up, and it's being held in place, and it's covered from anything that could potentially come off the vehicle and hit it and damage it. So you can see the hole that I put in that corner. I made it big enough so that when I run my brake line through it, I can put a piece of vacuum line on it or cover the brake line so the metal on metal doesn't damage itself, or the two pieces don't damage each other. Next thing I like to do is I like to lay out my lines, kind of mock them up how they're going to be set up on each wheel or each axle. From where we drilled the hole, which is right in this area, just underneath, you're going to have in your kit a very long line that's going to go through that hole and hook into the actuator. You see I've got it laid out here all the way back to my first axle, or my first wheel. Now in your kit, you're going to get a 4-way. It's going to look like this. It has 2 ends here and 2 here. The rubber lines go to your brakes. You're going to have one line that's shorter than this but longer than the other ones. That's going to be the one that goes across and connects the other 3 wheels together. The shorter lines are going to be the ones that connect from here to each wheel. Connecting each wheel, you're going to have a piece that looks like this. It's going to have 3 holes in it that are threaded. I'm going to thread the rubber line. I like to do it in the center. The one coming from the front wheel and to the side. One going to the back wheel and to the side. You just now connected your front wheel to your second one. The line coming back to your third one, you're going to have a straight fitting. It'll look like this. It's going to be threaded on both sides. Thread your rubber hose into one end. The line coming back to it into the other one. And you've just now connected all 3 of these. Now we're going to do the same thing on the other side of the trailer, except our front one is going to be a 3-way because we're attaching to the 4-way on the one side. Rubber line goes to the brake, straight long line coming from the other side, and then your line connecting to your second axle. 3-piece connector, rubber line to the brake, second line going back to your third axle, straight connector, rubber line to the brake. Now what I'm going to do is my longer line that needs to come from my actuator, I'm going to disconnect it from that first wheel. And I'm going to run it up and get it connected to my actuator and get my actuator mounted first. And then I can start connecting those back together back there. It's going to be a lot easier to get everything in here together while it's loose. Once we get it on here, we don't want this to really move because there's going to be a couple bends in it we're going to have to do where all of that back there is pretty much straight. So you can see I have an actuator mounted, the line coming into the back of the actuator, running down back behind the box, down to the floor, makes a slight curve, along the floor, over to the hole, and then out of the hole, and then we can start taking down our paneling underneath and getting our line tucked up underneath there and out of the way. Now if you don't want to run it this way, and if you don't, maybe hey, you don't have some of these components here and you want to bring that line out and go straight over and then down, in your kit you're going to get some holders like this. You're going to put your line in it, wherever you're going to run it, and you can simply take a screw and mount it right to the wall. So there's self-tappers in this trim piece for this paneling. Pull it down and you can see on my line is coming out of the hole. We just tuck it up in there like that. When we're finished, run our self-tappers back in and then our line stays secured up underneath this paneling here. So you can see we're back to our first axle and our line actually is almost going back to our third one. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to take this and we're going to have to loop it and then we'll tuck it up underneath it here so it's out of the way. One thing you don't want to do is you don't want to, as I mentioned before, kink it. So one way you can do it is you can take like we have quite a bit of line, so a 5-gallon bucket, and wrap the line around the 5-gallon bucket, and that'll give you some pretty big loops, and then you just take the loops and stick them up inside. What I'm going to do is this fitting here, you're going to have a trim piece, just like you did on the front. That's going to go like this. So once we bring our line out, or get this line, or long line, up inside of here, we have to get it out and connected to this. And this has to be mounted. There's a hole that runs straight through it, so we can run a self-tapper through there. What we can do is this piece is only held up with 2 self-tappers, one here and one at that end. But we want to make sure that we're going to have enough movement in this line, so when our axle goes up and down, we don't stress out the ends. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end up drilling a hole here into the frame, running a self-tapper right through it just like that, and that'll hold that there. This line underneath, I'm going to put a small hole here, I'm going to bring it out and go into the end. So we'll have a slight bend on it into here. And we can go straight from here, straight across to our other side. From here, we can get back to our second axle. Once you get your line looped up and inside, what I did is I cut a small slit here, as I mentioned before, run my line out into my 4-way. The rubber line runs down to my brake caliper. On the inside of the caliper, right about here, there's going to be a red cap like this. Remove the red cap, and this line is going to hook right into that location. I did the same thing for this line. When I took this and this off, or these 2 self-tappers off, I just kind of looped that line in. And if we take a look at our second one here, I came out into my fitting and did the same thing going to the back. Self-tapper here, this holds this bracket in place. We have no movement out of it. Again, rubber line, same red cap on the back of your brake caliper. And then for third axle, we have the straight piece. It has the 2 female ends in it. What I'm going to end up doing is, once we test it and we determine there's no leaks here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this, I'm going to shove it back up in there so it stays in there tight. It's not moving around like this. Then we have our line that's got to go across. What I did is put a small slit here. Same thing on the other side. While I had these 2 panels down, what I did is I slid it all the way through and then fed it out of the hole so it would go straight into the fitting. Same thing on that way, or on that side over there. Then you want to make sure, once you get this line ran, you're going to do the next 2 axles on that side the same way you did this side. Once you get all that done, you want to make sure you seal the slits that you put in there as much as possible. There is a bunch of insulation up here, and we want to make sure we weather seal it. So what I did is took some same type of tape, Gorilla Tape works, that they use for these panels. Put some silicone over the slit, and it's only about this big, straight across. Put some silicone, kind of seal around that line there, and then take your tape over it. If you tape over it while that Gorilla Tape's, while that silicone is wet, this tape will actually stick to it. It may hold it a little bit better to hold that tape on there. You want to make sure you do that with anywhere you're running a line through this paneling. Anytime you put a small bend like this in a line, you can see how this is coming out here, this one's here. You're going to use, I recommend using a tool like this, and this is to bend that line without putting a kink in it. If you don't have one of these, you can find these probably at your local auto part or hardware store. Once you get everything connected, including these down to the brakes, you're going to take a 3/8 wrench, and I recommend using a line wrench. It's going to look like this, and this keeps you from slipping off of that because these lines are so thin. You want to make sure you're not over tightening these to where you're actually putting a bend in the line where it's going into that fitting. Once you get all of those on, you get all of them tight, Now we can move up front and we can wire up our actuator. To wire our actuator, we're going to have 4 wires coming off it. Black, white, blue, and yellow. Black wire is going to be 12 volts. White wire is going to be ground. Blue wire is going to go to the brake controller coming through the 7-pole plug from the vehicle. Or yellow is going to go to the cold side of our breakaway switch that's mounted on our Kingpin. Keep in mind, the wires that we run, they need to be 12 gauge wire in order for the system to function properly. So, to get your lines from here up to our pin box, this panel right here is actually, there's a hollow space in there because there's insulation in there. What you can do is take a wire hanger, something that has a little bit of stiffness to it, and right in this edge, you pull this down, you can take it and slide it all the way through, and it's going to come out right up here, right on the inside. Once you get there, you're going to take your wires, you're going to tie them or tape them onto the end of that wire, and you can pull them up through, and they'll go from here to there. Now, I myself like to use same color wires, except I did not have 12 gauge wire that was the same color. So, this is jacketed wire. This is going to be my power and ground. And I had some other black and white. I'm going to use my black wire, and you can see I painted the end of it yellow. This is going to be for my breakaway switch. This is going to go to my blue wire, which is going to be connected to the braking system coming through the 7-pole plug. Up inside our pin box, we're going to have a box like this. It's got all of our wiring going to it. It's going to have a cap on it, a couple of screws in the corners, just pop the cap off. Inside of it, all the wires come from our 7-pole plug, which hooks up to the back of our vehicle and runs to the wires running into the trailer to work all of your light functions, like your reverse lights if you have them, brake lights, running lights, and turn signals. What we need to do is we need to determine which wires we need to tap into coming from the 7-pole plug. So our brake wire typically is going to be a blue wire in our 7-pole plug, and we need to make sure that it's a blue wire coming out of our 7-pole plug and not one coming from the camper. You can see there's a couple different ones in here. You find all the wires coming from the 7-pole plug and kind of separate them. What you can do is you can go through everything, test it, and just do a process of elimination. I determined that this blue wire coming from my 7-pole plug on this side is going to be our brake wire. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and show you. And the way you can test it is just hook the 7-pole plug up to the back of your vehicle. Have somebody sit in the vehicle and just work your brake controller. There we go. Now we know that that blue wire right there from our 7-pole plug is going to be our brake signal. Cold side of our breakaway switch. Breakaway switch is going to have 2 wires on it. One of them is going to be hot, which is going to run to a battery mounted inside the camper, which is this one here. We need the other one, which is going to be this one. And how you can tell that, you can take your tester, and one wire should always have power. So that's how we determined that this wire here from a breakaway switch is going to be the cold side. What I did is I just put a little piece of tape on it. Same thing I did with the blue wire. Ground wire is pretty much going to be the same, and it's going to be this bundle of white wires here. It's going to be the white wire coming out of the 7-pole plug. Next one is going to be our 12-volt circuit coming from our 7-pole plug. We know this one has power now. The only wire left, because we eliminated all the other ones with our signals, is going to be this black wire, and that's coming from our 7-pole plug. That's going to be our power wire coming from our vehicle. So here we have power and ground connected. Let's see if I can try to explain this. The cold side of the breakaway switch and our blue wire coming from our 7-pole plug, which is our brake controller from our vehicle, was into the same bundle of wire. However, since we are doing hydraulic brakes, our blue and yellow wire from our actuator cannot be connected together. So what we did is we disconnected or pulled the blue wire coming from the 7-pole plug out of this bundle and connected it to the blue wire going to the actuator, which in my case was my white wire that I ran separate. My black wire with my yellow stripe is the one I tied into that bundle with the cold side of the breakaway switch wire. So once we have our wires tied in on our pin box, we need to attach them to the wires coming from our actuator. If you remember, the black and white wire in the jacket, which is the gray here, that was the power and ground. Ground's going to be white, power's going to be black. With our ground wire, we need to add a small wire with the ring terminal and ground it to the frame, as well as attaching it to the wire on the actuator. Then you just have your blue and yellow wire to your brake controller and to the cold side of your brake switch. Once you get that, what I did is I took one of the loom clamps, they come in the kit, and attached them right up here to this frame rail so that they're up and out of the way. And this is completely up to you. I just like everything to kind of stay hidden as much as possible. You can take some wire loom, put it around your wires like this once you're done. And to attach them, I actually use heat shrink butt connectors. You can use regular ones because they're inside here, but I like to use heat shrink because they are outside. They are susceptible to moisture, so doing heat shrink kind of helps protect those connections from corrosion. Once we have everything hooked up, we need to add fluid into our actuator. We're going to need 2 people to do this. We can do it 2 ways. You can hook the 7-pole plug up to the back of your vehicle and use a brake controller to activate the brakes, or you can pull the breakaway switch mounted on the Kingpin. But what you want to do is make sure that the lid does not go on, because this has a rubber ring in it, and what we don't want to do is we don't want to suck that rubber ring down in there. And every time we do one, and it's only going to be a split second, we need to make sure we're adding fluid to it because we don't want this to dry out. So we want to make sure it's topped off. So now we'll get a second person, we'll go back and start bleeding our brakes. What we have is we have a tube with a bottle connected to the top port on our caliper. We're going to take an 8mm socket. I'm going to have somebody pull the breakaway switch, and it's going to force the fluid in here. What we're looking for is solid fluid. If we have any bubbles, we're going to bleed our brakes until we get rid of the bubbles. Go ahead. Off. What we're doing is we're starting with the brakes that are farthest away from the actuator. Our actuator is kind of centered, so we can either start on this side or the other side on our 3rd axle back. Let's see, we got clear fluid, good. We'll close it off, and we'll move to the next one. While you're bleeding your brakes, one thing you want to do is check all your fittings where your lines are running in and make sure you don't have any leaks. If you do, tighten them up, and I suggest running through the bleeding process again, because if you have a leak, you could potentially get an air bubble or something like that in there. Once you've checked all of your lines in the back, make sure you don't forget about the fitting on the back of the actuator. Once you've got that done, completely up to you, but what I did is I took some wire loom and I covered the brake line that's running along the floor here and going down through the hole, and I ran it all the way to where it starts to go underneath that panel. Now I'll get underneath and I'm going to seal the bottom of that hole with some silicone. Once you've fixed any leaks, go ahead and reinstall your wheels. You want to make sure you torque down your lug bolts to the proper specifications for your size wheels. After that, you're ready to go. It's going to do it for look at and installation on the Hydrastar Hydraulic Brake Kit on a 2020 Grand Design Momentum Toy Hauler.